the title suggests, we will be getting to what is it that's so hard about Korean pronunciation for Korean language learners. Before getting too far along into the talk, I'd just like to make some brief acknowledgments. So this is a picture of an MSU Second Language Studies alumni gathering here in Seoul. And really, I was able to make this whole project happen because of a connection with an alumni from my program, Dr. Jun-Kyu Lee, who is at Hankuk University Foreign Studies. You can see a lovely picture up there. And when it came to putting together my Fulbright application, I reached out to Dr. Lee, and for the last several months, I've been spending a lot of time on that campus as a Fulbright junior researcher. So yeah, I'm really grateful to all the support I've had so far, and let's get to the talk. So today's talk will kind of be divided into roughly 3 parts. I'll start off with some background information to kind of catch everybody up on second language Korean pronunciation. And then I'll introduce my project, kind of give you the scope of this test I've developed and the research I've been conducting. And then we'll move on. I'll be sharing some of my initial findings. So for background, I know not everybody in the room is a linguist, so let's do a little crash course in what is phonology, okay? So phonology is part of linguistics, and it's the part that deals with the kind of systematic organization of sounds in a language. And the key concept here is that phonology looks for the differences among sounds that can distinguish differences in meaning, okay? So a really easy example of this, we'll use English to start, but the difference between pet and bet, okay, there's a little bit of a sound difference that's meaningful, okay? So that gets at what phonology is. This is different but related to phonetics, which is another term you and I have heard. Phonetics is more about measuring the physical qualities of sound. So you can put numbers on everything really easily, how loud it is, what the pitch is, and so forth. They're related, but phonology is more about what we got in our heads that is different and can distinguish meaning. So when we talk about phonology, we primarily can kind of break that down into 2 areas, segmental features and suprasegmental features. So for segmental features, we're basically talking about phonemes. These are the individual sounds that can be used to distinguish different meanings in a language. So for example, if we take a look at a few Korean phonemes, we have K, Gyok, and then we have a tensed K, Sangyok, and an aspirated K, Kyok. Okay, so those are 3 different sounds. Those are used to make words with different meanings. And then the other area is suprasegmental features. You might have heard the term prosody before. This deals with things like intonation, word stress in English, things of that nature. All right, but we're going to be focusing actually on phonemes today. So this is a little bit small, but let's kind of do a quick walkthrough of what are the sounds of Korean. So Korean, by most descriptions, has about 28 or 29 different sounds. I'm working with one that has 28. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the terms consonants and vowels. Okay. So good to see you're a linguist. You've got a little background already. I'd just like to quickly discuss some of the features of the various consonants and vowels in Korean. So looking at the top, there are several stop consonants. So stop is when airflow is completely blocked when you make the sound. And there are 9 of those in Korean. And they're distinguished, these stops, by being lax, tense, or aspirated. So we'll go through some examples. The lax sounds are P, T, and K. That's how linguists denote them. But in Korean letters, it's biuk, digut, and kyuk. So kind of, for me, these are the baseline ones, okay? Kind of plain. You don't have to do anything too special when you're making these sounds. Next come the tense sounds, and linguists put a little star next to them, but these are the double letters, the tensori, sangyok, sangyuk, and sangyuk. And so these require a little bit more energy, is maybe the best way to describe it. So when you make this sound, you have a little bit more energy coming out than the lax sound. And then last is aspirated. So there's little H's above the letters, and this is Pia, Tia, and Kyo. Okay, great. Next comes fricatives, okay, and we have 3 of them. A fricative means the air isn't being stopped, it's just being kind of partially blocked to make the sound. So when you make an S sound, a shiot sound, there's still air coming out. Same with hiet, okay, and same with Sancheon as well. Okay, and Sancheon is tense, so it's another one of those tense sounds. Below that we have affricates. There's just 3 affricates in Korean. These kind of combine stops and fricatives. So you start off kind of blocking everything, but then you have to let some air out. So this is jiet, sanjiet, and chiet. Okay. Then come the nasals. So we have mium, nium, and ium in Korean. A nasal just means it uses your nose. Air is coming through your nose. So actually, this is sort of a fun trick. If you try to say a word with a nasal while plugging your nose, it doesn't work. So if I try to say the Korean word mium, the name of that letter, mium, it doesn't work. Okay. And then last consonant is a liquid. Liquids are hard to describe. I don't know. There's actually somebody who's probably better at speech science than I am who could probably give a better explanation in the room. But air is kind of moving around your tongue, kind of sort of freely, but it changes something about the air, the way it is released from the mouth, that creates a consonant sound. All right, so those are the consonants. Everybody following okay so far? Okay, just as a review in case you're not familiar with Korean. The vowels I won't spend as much time on. Vowels are mainly distinguished by whether your tongue is sort of forward in the mouth or back in the mouth, and then how high your tongue is in the mouth. And then the shape of your lips. So, and the shape of your lips is really easy to see. For Korean, when your lips are rounded, you can have vowels like u and o. And then there's a whole bunch of unrounded vowels where the shape will be a little different depending on the vowel, but in general, it's just kind of sort of neutral, maybe a little bit widened. Okay. One thing you might notice here is that there are 2 Korean letters that correspond to this funny-looking backwards 3. Okay, e and a spelled a-e and a-e. In Seoul Korean, the most widely spoken variety in the country, there's no difference between these 2 sounds, essentially. Okay, it's the same underlying phoneme. And then the very last thing to bring up are glides. So glides are kind of halfway between vowels and consonants, and they always need a vowel following them. Okay, so in Korean we have glide vowel combinations like yo, ya, yo. Okay, that one yo, ya, yo. That first sound is represented by J in linguistics, and then there's also glide vowel combinations like wa, wo, wo. And that first sound is represented by W. In case you were wondering about maybe one of the more difficult sounds for you to say, if you're a second language speaker, this guy, like ija and isa, that sound that I don't know, I could be a little bit better at myself. This has a glide in it. One way of kind of describing this would be starting with that sound, and then putting the glide on the back side. This is called a back glide. A little controversial, but I like it because it's a little simpler. I don't have to introduce a new glide. So anyhow, this is the whole picture. This is what learners need to master in order to have basically intelligible Korean pronunciation. Right? So now I'd like to go into a little more detail about second language pronunciation. And the framework I use for examining it. So I follow a framework that considers pronunciation along 3 different dimensions: intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accentiveness. Intelligibility is just how much of what you say is understood by a listener. Comprehensibility is how easily a listener can understand what you say. And then accentiveness is how much of a difference a listener perceives between the way you talk and the way they talk. Right? And there are some important connections among these 3 dimensions. So they're all based on listeners. Okay? Because really this is what counts, is how well somebody else is able to understand you. There are ways of looking at pronunciation where you measure the pitch, you look at various physical aspects of sound, but that's what I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm more concerned with how listeners are able to understand you. Intelligibility and comprehensibility are pretty closely linked. If your speech is not very intelligible, people aren't going to have a very easy time understanding you. Okay, they're going to have to put forth a lot more effort to try to figure out what it is you're saying. Comprehensibility and accentedness, these are kind of related in that listeners usually perceive them very similarly. So if you are easy to understand, they're going to perceive that you have a lesser accent. You might still have some accent according to their perception, but again, it might not be considered so large. And then the other connection, or possible connection to talk about, is really important because it's not a direct connection at all. So your speech as a second language speaker can be just about completely intelligible, but people will still perceive you as having an accent. And in fact, if you learned a second language in your late teens and into adulthood, chances are you're always going to have at least a little bit of an accent. I know I do. I didn't start learning Korean until I was 22, 23. I'm probably always going to sound a little bit like an American when I speak Korean. So, and that's fine though, because intelligibility is what really counts. This has been called the intelligibility principle by people who work in the field, and it recognizes the limits on acquiring native-like pronunciation, especially for adult learners. Instead, the focus is just on being understood. So beyond intelligibility, comprehensibility is also considered important. It's never a bad thing if your listener has an easier time understanding you. And this leads to some pretty strong implications for pedagogy and assessment. It kind of directs us to what should teachers be teaching when it comes to pronunciation, and then how should we evaluate the pronunciation of second language speakers. And because intelligibility is so important, there's a lot of research been conducted with second language learners trying to figure out what affects intelligibility. And one of the big standouts is segmental features, so the phonemes of a language. If you substitute in a wrong phoneme or you pronounce phonemes in a way that listeners can't quite figure out which phoneme it is you're saying, that has a pretty big negative impact on your intelligibility. There are also other things. It's not completely one-sided. Things like syllable structure errors, word level stress for languages like English that have word stress, intonation, and so forth. But segmental features are really commonly found in research to be a big impact on intelligibility. And then developmentally, it's worth considering a few key things about learning pronunciation in the second language. So for one, on the left, your starting point is not zero. When you start learning a second language, you have a whole bunch of phonemes that might line up with the second language and might not. So your first language, also other languages you know. I know a lot of people learn Korean as their third, fourth, fifth language sometimes. So people have a lot already that they can draw on. This is really important because it relates to models of second language phonological acquisition. Most models for this tend to incorporate an idea called assimilation, where you sort of collapse new sounds with old sounds that you already have, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about this in a minute. And this also relates to an idea called the perception-production link. So this is the idea that the accuracy with which you can hear the difference between sounds tends to go hand in hand with the accuracy with which you can produce sounds in a second language. And sometimes, and this is really interesting, if you just work on listening and hearing the difference between sounds better, you get kind of direct benefits to pronouncing those sounds. There's also some other things to consider in terms of developing pronunciation, and these are things we know from research. There are some sounds that tend to be difficult across the board for Korean learners, particularly tense consonants, those double letters, sangyeo, san, shira, things like that. Even for very advanced level speakers, they still have some trouble pronouncing those reliably. So we kind of have some expectations about what's going to be hard. The good thing is, though, we know that instruction, so specific teaching or studying of pronunciation, can be effective. So learners can make improvements even if they didn't start learning until they were 25 or 30 or 40. If they practice, if they get good instruction, they can make improvements to become more intelligible. And the end point, as I've already kind of talked about, most learners, especially adult learners, are not going to end up sounding like a native South Korean. Shucks. But you can sound very intelligible. I mean, if you've ever watched one of those programs on Korean TV, like Sincheon-dong, they speak Korean very, very well, but most of them still sound a little bit like foreigners, right? Any Koreans in the room? Do you agree? Yeah, okay. But they speak very, very well and largely intelligibly. So, yeah, a bit more on that assimilation point, because this is really interesting and maybe a chance for some audience participation. So, from the perspective of a native speaker of English learning Korean, which sounds of Korean are almost identical to English sounds? Does anybody want to share? Okay, yeah, Margaret?
I feel like I just know it's M and N.
M and N, they're basically like English M and N, so mium and nien. And I see some Koreans in the audience nodding their head, like, yeah, that's probably right. Okay, so what's happening there with assimilation when monolingual English speaker Dan tried learning Korean for the first time? M and N, I could just map those on, so mium and nien, I could just plop those right into my existing phonemes in my head. So that's easy, hooray. What about sounds of Korean that are kind of similar to English sounds? Can we think of things that are not exactly the same, but kind of similar in Korean?
B.
B?
B.
Right, so English B and Korean B. Yeah, those are pretty close. Yeah, but not exactly, right?
Yeah, not exactly.
Close enough. So sometimes people will just take Korean B and say, oh, that's kind of close enough to English B. And when they start out, they just treat them the same. So they'll pronounce English B's in Korean words with B. Yeah, is there another one?
The O sound.
Yeah. So English O and Korean O. I mean, I don't know if I probably just use the English O, honestly, when I speak Korean. But they are a little bit different, okay? But again, a lot of people will just say, close enough. I hear them just about the same, and so they produce them pretty similarly to the sound in their first language. Are there any sounds in Korean that come across to anybody as totally different from English? Okay, so for Koreans who've learned English, the V sound, it's complete. There's no Korean analog. Z, right? And the TH sound. So there's actually two different kinds of TH sounds in English, theta and thorn, the voiced and voiceless ones. Yeah, so you hear those very different, but actually pronouncing them is still kind of difficult, especially when you start learning the language. So perceiving isn't a 100% solution, but yeah, it can help. Yeah, for the other way around.
Real.
Yes.
So it sounds totally different.
Yeah, it's somewhere in between L and R, but it's neither L nor R.
Right. I thought somebody would bring that up for the second question here, because it's like, well, it's kind of close to English L and sometimes kind of close to English R. But yeah, it is very different. I think what happens a lot of times, even in that case, because it's sort of close enough, people will sort of treat it like an English L. So, and I don't know, English L's are a little bit, for lack of a better term, heavier. So they'll say like lamyan or, mal, like really kind of exaggerated, like going to the mall in English, hangumaru, like making that kind of an English L. Right, so those are examples of assimilation where we're just kind of treating sounds as similar. Assimilation can also happen when there are two second language sounds that are so similar you can't quite hear the difference, so you sort of just pick one way or the other and go with it. So are there any two Korean sounds you can think of that sound almost identical or at least kind of similar to you? Yeah.
The one you said before of like the A and A, I can't tell.
Oh, well, that's actually fine because at least Koreans who grew up in Seoul, they can't tell either. Yeah.
But then I always feel stupid when I spell it the wrong way. Like,
Right,
I don't know
so
what
it becomes a spelling problem.
but I feel
yeah.
it. I'm like, stupid. I should have done the other one.
So sound-wise, you're actually okay. You're just like a native Korean. Are there any other examples where there's two Korean sounds? Yeah.
O and R.
Right. O and A. Those sound kind of similar to a lot of English speakers for some reason, and actually speakers from other languages too. Just like we mentioned earlier, English O and Korean O are not exactly the same, and then is also kind of like an English sound, but not exactly all the time. So, is there another picture?
I used to have a lot of trouble distinguishing and oo. Like,
Okay.
it's a lot easier now, but in the beginning I could not hear the difference at all.
So there's all kinds of complicated things that could be going on there. It could be that two new sounds are sort of merged into one new sound category, or it could be that two new sounds are merged into one first language sound category. I think I kind of do that, or at least did that. I hope I don't do it anymore. Xia and Sanxia, and I would, my wife would sometimes tease me like when I would try to say the word for uncooked rice, sao. Apparently, for the longest time, it says sao, like just flesh, or across weird. So yeah, those were two Korean sounds that for me sounded, I couldn't tell the difference for a few years. I mean, really hard. So those get assimilated. That creates a lot of difficulty for learners of Korean. So that's one reason why I haven't talked about what's so hard, but this is why things are so hard sometimes. All right, so I'm going to move on now to my study. So my dissertation and my Fulbright project is called Diagnosing Second Language Pronunciation, and I look at measuring phoneme perception and production, and the idea is to inform learning, to help people improve their pronunciation, become more intelligible. So one problem is that whole class pronunciation instruction might not meet individual needs. And actually, maybe even a bigger problem is that pronunciation just isn't taught that much in language classes. We know this from surveys of teachers. They just don't spend a whole lot of class time on pronunciation. They spend more time on grammar, vocabulary, and maybe skills-based things like working on reading skills or writing skills. Pronunciation just kind of falls off the map sometimes. But if you do want to work on pronunciation, individuals tend to have very different needs. And that raises a different problem. It's hard to know what an individual's needs are. And this isn't a new idea. Robert Lotto, who's really influential in applied linguistics and early second language acquisition, noticed this like 60 years ago almost. Teachers whose observations about their students are usually quite good, quite accurate, are still limited with how much they can know about the pronunciation difficulties that learners have. And I would just add that teachers probably know even less about what sounds their students have trouble hearing. When a student has trouble pronouncing something, they'll notice the really obvious things. Like when I say sao and sao is the same word, like, okay, I can remember that. Dan can't do sangxia. But they won't know whether I have trouble hearing that necessarily. And learners might have even more trouble understanding what's actually difficult for them and maybe just what they think is difficult because they don't have as good perception in Korean and it's just harder. So one potential solution comes from a type of testing, a type of assessment called diagnostic language assessment. And most of you, when you think of tests or assessment, language tests, you might think of something like, if you're Korean, the first word that might pop to mind is like TOEFL or IELTS, okay? If you're a learner of Korean, you might think, oh yeah, TOPIK, that's a Korean test, okay? These are tests, so those kind of tests are called proficiency tests, and they just tell you at a very broad level how good or bad you are at the language. That's important for some purposes, but not very useful for helping you figure out what you need to study. Okay? Diagnostic language assessment focuses on helping you understand what you need to study. It looks for strengths and weaknesses in your abilities in a way that's relevant to subsequent learning or studying that you can do. They're very targeted and discrete, and they rely more on theories of language development than descriptions of language proficiency. And so I went ahead and developed a test from the ground up called the Korean Pronunciation Diagnostic. You might hear me refer to it by the initials KPD. It's detailed, discrete test of Korean phoneme control. It focuses only on lower level production and perception of phonemes. And I believe the information you get out of the test is instructionally relevant. It's something a teacher or learner could do something with. And it's fairly practical to administer. It doesn't take too much time or resources. So to develop the test, I went through 2 piloting phases before getting at this sort of operational version that I've been using for research here in Korea. And the test was designed around the 28 phonemes of Korean. And the tasks were designed based on processing models of listening and speaking in a second language. And zooming in on kind of lower level tasks that tap into phonological knowledge. So things involving input decoding on the listening side, and on the speaking side, tasks that get at just basic phonological encoding and phonetic encoding. I sort of designed the tasks to exclude knowledge of grammar, knowledge of more complicated vocabulary, so that those things aren't coming into what I'm trying to learn about their pronunciation. Really just keeps it simple and gets at pronunciation. And so what does the test look like? Well, we'll take a look here. So the test has two sections, production and perception, so pronunciation and hearing. And each section has two tasks. And we'll take a closer look at each one of these tasks. So the first task is called picture naming. And it's really simple. You see a picture and you say the Korean vocabulary word for it. So this is a picture of a rabbit. In Korean, that's toki. And if a learner says something like, toki, okay? Did it sound like he said it right? I mean,
It sounded doki and toki.
yes, you would be a good person to rate this test. I agree with the first person who scored it. So yeah, that first sound was sort of somewhere between, wasn't sure if it was toki or doki. So because that wasn't clear, that one was scored as wrong. But the other three sounds were pretty immediately recognizable as what they should be, so it's scored as correct. The next task is non-word reading, and here they just get some Korean letters, and they just have to read it out loud. So this says si, and if a learner says something like, no, yeah, Koreans immediately turning. That wasn't a sangshia, so wasn't immediately, it sounded more like shia, right? So that would be scored as incorrect. Moving on to the perception side, the listening part, is a pronunciation judgment task. So this is a little bit like a mirror image of the picture naming. And in this one, they see a picture, and it's not super easy to see on the projector, but that's a picture of Japan, okay? And they hear somebody saying that word. The trick is, some of the words they hear have a deliberate pronunciation mistake in it. So they need to decide whether the word was pronounced correctly or incorrectly. So the Korean word for Japan is ilbon, and that's with the lax, the biup in the middle. But what they hear is, right? And no, it wasn't quite right. That middle sound, that what should have been a biup, was pronounced as tanbiup, tensed. And so they should select that it was incorrectly pronounced. And then the last task is identification. And this is where they hear a sound and need to choose the letters that they heard. So when they hear something like this, which one should they pick? One. Oh, you guys are good. You probably get really good scores on this. So after taking the test, and after a teacher, I had an experienced instructor of Korean score all of the learners, they received a diagnostic score report. This is presented in Korean, and the first page, which you see on the left here, is entirely verbal. There's no numbers. I don't want them to just try to find their total score or anything. I want them to really focus on the information, which sounds they have difficulty pronouncing. So any sound that they pronounce accurately, less than 75% of the time, shows up on this first page. And they also get information on whether they also have trouble hearing that sound or not. And then there's also some supplementary information about difficult features. So if they tend to have trouble with many sounds that have the tense feature, that'll show up. And also some information on difficult context. So if they tend to have trouble pronouncing sounds that are at the beginning of words, that would show up there as well. On the back page, the second page, which you see on the right, they get the full detailed score report, their accuracy in pronunciation and listening for each phoneme, and they also get examples of words that they mispronounced or misheard from the test. Okay, so on to the research part, the validation study, and then getting on to the results. So because this is a test, we need to look at the validity of the test. I use a framework called argument-based validity for investigating how good a test is at doing what you want it to do. I won't go into too much depth here, because as helpful as these things are, they're terribly long and drawn out, and they're not really presentation friendly. But I'll be looking at kind of two aspects of validity. The first aspect is explanation. So it's how much do the scores on the test actually reflect the thing you're trying to measure, in this case pronunciation of phonemes and perception of phonemes. And then utilization, and this is how well are users of the test able to do good things with the test results. Okay. So the research questions, I'm going to be looking at how the item difficulties, so how the phoneme difficulties line up with what we might expect. and whether or not the KPD can identify relatively unique learner profiles in terms of pronunciation difficulties. And then another couple questions kind of focusing on how people use the test. So can the KPD help raise learner awareness? And how do learners actually do things? What do they do with the results from the test? So for methods, there are two parts to this study that I've been conducting. First is field testing, and that's the 198 learners of Korean that I've had come into a little lab space and take a bunch of tests. And then a subset of those learners, 21, participated in follow-up interviews. So for the field testing, they did a language background questionnaire, self-assessment, an independent speaking test, the KPD, and a listed imitation test. Really today we're just going to be talking about the self-assessment and the KPD. For the self-assessment, before they took the KPD, I asked them to just rate how difficult they thought it was to pronounce each sound, so kiok, and hear it on a scale from 1 to 7. And then I'll go on to compare these with their actual results. And then for the interviews, I had, again, 21 students, and then I also have people coming in for a second interview. This is still in progress. And this is just kind of getting their live reactions to what they thought about the results paper when they first saw it, and some discussion of what they've been doing to learn Korean pronunciation. So for initial results and findings, let's take a look. So some really basic stuff here. This is just total scores on each section. Not a whole lot we can get from this, except in general, people actually scored quite well. Okay, most learners had a pretty good command of, if not most, then a good chunk of Korean phonemes. The ranges you see here, so like for example, out of all of the pronunciation items, there are 217 total. The lowest score was actually 178. So it's not, this test isn't showing that people have just awful pronunciation, but as we'll see in a moment, it really pinpoints which sounds they have pronunciation difficulties with, and doesn't judge them too harshly on the sounds that they can produce mostly intelligibly. The test, and I looked at this in several different ways, is mostly reliable. So all of the little questions on the test, they tend to work together quite well. And even among the sections, they correlate the different tasks, the scores on the different tasks, correlate fairly highly, indicating that they're all kind of getting at aspects of the same thing. Okay, now the more interesting part, we get on to item difficulties. So now we're going to answer the question, really, what's so hard about Korean pronunciation, by looking at this figure. So here we can see on the x-axis, the average perception accuracy, so hearing, and on the y-axis, the average production accuracy of the 28 phonemes of Korean. So the easiest ones are going to be near the top for pronouncing. That'd be sounds like ah, e, and. Okay, most second language learners of Korean have very little difficulty pronouncing those correctly. Also, the M sound, mium, because most languages have a sound like that, almost exactly. It tends to just be really easy for learners. It's also easier for them to hear. The most difficult sounds were, as we might have guessed, the tense sounds. So this is sanjia, sangbia, sangbiga, sangyuk, and sangjia. Okay, those are the most difficult. I was actually sort of surprised to see that sangjia was actually the most difficult. But yeah, a lot of people below, on average, people were below 80% or just right around 8% on a lot of those. But this lines up really neatly with expectations. Other research has shown that even advanced learners of Korean tend to have difficulties with those sounds. So seeing it here is a good thing from a testing perspective. Again, on the high end, I already mentioned. Some other relatively easy sounds would be like o, u, and jia for production. Things like ium, weren't too bad. Some of the aspirated sounds, kiok, piok, tiet, and chiat, tended to be sort of mid-range in terms of pronunciation difficulty. Okay? And this sort of makes sense. They require you to do a little more complicated things when it comes to moving your mouth around to produce the sounds. And actually, one little surprise is that, sorry, I used the linguist notation here, but this is Rio. And I think what's going on here is that even though many second language learners of Korean have, you really notice their accents when they pronounce sounds like Rio. But because there aren't any other sounds in Korean that are very similar to Rio, somebody who's listening can identify what it is they're trying to say. Whether it's an American sort of making a really heavy L, or a Chinese first language speaker sort of turning it into a Chinese sound like R, okay? It isn't easily confusable for another Korean sound. So from a perspective of intelligibility, learners actually don't have as much trouble with Rio as they might think they do. Koreans will generally be able to kind of pick out what they're trying to say. And then I also looked at profiles of learners. So what I did here was use a statistical technique called cluster analysis to come up with 5 different general profiles for pronunciation difficulties. Okay, so this plot, ooh, and the colors do not work well on this projector. I apologize about that. But this plot shows the average accuracy for learners divided up into these 5 different clusters for each phoneme. I know this is a lot to take in, but instead of looking at the trees, try to look at the forest here. The forest on the far right, that far right column, is very green. Okay, these are people who have, generally, this whole group, on average, is really accurate across almost every Korean phoneme. So these are people who we could probably expect to have really intelligible Korean pronunciation. Okay? The other forests look a little bit different. There are different colors. You see some orangish, reddish looking things, and in different places. Okay? Another way of looking at this data is converting it to the proportion of people who had difficulty with a phoneme. So not just the average accuracy, but how many people were flagged as saying, okay, this is a sound you probably need to work on. And here the patterns get a little starker, a little bit easier to see. We see some dark reds, so meaning almost everybody in this group had some difficulty with that sound. And when we start looking at what are in these clusters of pronunciation difficulties, we see that the first cluster actually has kind of okay pronunciation in general, mostly intelligible, but they have difficulty with some tense consonants. In particular, it was the affricate and fricative. So 상지읒 and 상시읒. Okay, they had trouble with that. They also had a little bit of trouble with this vowel, okay, which some of you mentioned earlier, say for example, sounds kind of close to O in Korean. Okay, the second cluster. These folks were actually really interesting because they didn't have that much trouble with tense sounds. They had much more trouble with the aspirated sounds. So that'd be like kiuk, tiut, and chiut. Okay, they had more trouble with that than tense sounds. So they're really kind of unique compared to these other groups of learners. The third cluster just had some difficulty with tense consonants. Again, this cluster actually looks pretty good. They might be on their way to becoming cluster 5s. And then cluster 4 had major difficulties with tense sounds. Again, almost everybody just couldn't really reliably produce any of the tense sounds, like 상기역, 상디귿, and 상디귿. They also had some trouble distinguishing among the different T sounds, so 디귿, 상디귿, and tiut. And they also had trouble with and a little bit of trouble with ium, actually. So this cluster was a little bit unique and tended to have some of the most problems. I decided to look into this a little bit further because if the clustering was just showing different profiles were basically just people from different language backgrounds, well then that's maybe not as interesting, maybe not as individualized as I would have hoped. So I looked at the language backgrounds of the people who fell into each cluster. And you see here, highlighted in red, are Chinese speakers. These were this was my biggest group of participants, about close to 90, I believe, in the whole sample. And a lot of them did fall into cluster 1, okay? Difficulty with tense consonants, especially 상지읒 and 상시읒, and also all. But there were also a handful of other first languages in that cluster. And then when you look at where other Chinese speakers fell, well, actually a lot of them fell into that really happy place cluster. They've got good control over pronouncing all the sounds. And then a handful fell into cluster 3 and cluster 4. So those Chinese speakers had more in common with the Russian and English speakers in those clusters than they did with the other Chinese speakers in cluster 1. So to me, this kind of shows that the test was able to get at some more individualized diagnosis of pronunciation difficulties rather than just saying, okay, you're from China, you're going to have trouble with X, Y, and Z. And now moving on to learner awareness. So I had learners complete those self-assessments I showed you earlier. And what I did is I started comparing them to their actual KPD results. So this plot shows each dot is one learner. And on the x-axis, it's the correlation between their KPD score for perception and their self-assessment of how difficult it was to perceive phonemes. And this is averaged across all the phonemes. So it gives a sense of how good were they at sort of realizing the relative difficulty they had hearing the different sounds of Korean. And then on the y-axis is for production, how their kind of awareness, how good were they at distinguishing which sounds were difficult or easy for them to pronounce. And we can sort of see a general pattern. People who were better at sort of knowing what was difficult to pronounce were also better at knowing what was difficult for them to perceive. But there were a lot of people who didn't have a good sense. The correlations between their self-assessments and their KPD scores were pretty low, and in some cases negative. Like, they kind of had it backwards. So these people would potentially have a lot to learn from getting a sort of objective score report, a diagnostic report saying, here's what you actually have difficulty with. Another way of looking is sort of just in terms of raw accuracy, subtracting the self-assessment from the KPD score. And we can see in the center circle, so again, each dot is one learner. In the center circle there were a number of learners who on average were less than 10% off in their self-assessments. So if they said that the ah sound was totally easy, 7 out of 7, they tended to score very, very highly in ah on the KPD, for example. And they tended to be accurate like that across all the different sounds. However, there are a number of people who are between 10 and 30% off on average. So there were at least a few sounds that those individuals were, they had a major misunderstanding of exactly how difficult the sound was for them. And then there are people in that outer ring who have some major misunderstandings of how easy or difficult Korean sounds are for them. And actually, a lot of them fell into that quadrant 1, and that means they were overestimating the difficulty of Korean sounds. So sort of an unexpected thing that came up, maybe getting the score report could kind of be, I don't know, a stress reliever for some folks who are like, okay, actually I'm not doing so bad with a lot of these sounds. Instead, I should just focus on these 2 or 3. And then what did the learners say? So this is coming from the interview data. When they saw their KPD reports, well, some of them weren't sure about terms. I tried to avoid linguistic terms, but I still had terms in there like kyungum for particular features that they were having difficulty with. Kyungum is the Korean word for tense sound. And then I tried to explain to them, like pensori, and they're like, I don't know what that is. So that's a challenge, I think, in helping or in creating results that are really helpful to learners. They have to be able to understand it in detail. They wanted to know more, so the example words, they wanted to know what are the words from speaker and listening. But most importantly, in a lot of cases, when they saw, they were told that they had difficulty with sounds X, Y, and Z, they're like, yeah, that looks right to me. But in some cases, there would be a sound that surprised them. There's one learner, I shouldn't even say learner, she's very proficient, graduate student who was from Vietnam, who she said she had no idea that her pronunciation wasn't well distinguished for biep and piep. And this is somebody who's getting a graduate degree in Korean, very good speaker, but just still there's things that people aren't quite aware of. And so how did they utilize the results? This is coming from the data where I've had people come back in for a second interview after about 3 months from getting their initial score report. And this data is really interesting. So one student, this is an intensive language program student from Mexico. she said she started thinking about the double consonants, the tense sounds a lot. She really listened close. She started listening closely to the way her teacher was pronouncing those sounds. So she's paying more attention to specific things in class. Some people started using new apps. So the very proficient Korean speaker from Vietnam, she tried practicing with Google. So she would say a word like "bop" and see if Google would write "pop" or "bop" on the speech to text. I don't know if that's the best app for studying pronunciation, but it's interesting to see what somebody would try to do with the information. Others just talk with their teachers. So somebody who was in the intensive Korean program, she went to her teacher after class and showed her the report and asked for some feedback and got feedback periodically. She actually said that sometimes getting feedback didn't make her feel great because mostly negative, but she appreciated having feedback nonetheless as opposed to not getting it. One interviewee went as far as hiring a tutor to help her work on pronunciation. She was very insecure about her pronunciation to start with, but when she had the report, she decided to take a little more action and see if she could make some improvements. And to be completely transparent, so far 2 of the 8 said they haven't really done much with the diagnostic report. They did talk about how they were studying for the TOPIK, which doesn't have a speaking section. So they're working on their writing a lot. And I don't know, I guess this just goes to show you can't win them all. So yeah, I'll go ahead and stop there. I think that's hopefully right on time. Right, okay, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Have you heard anybody talk about, or has anyone brought it up? To me, the difference between one like Korean consonant, depending on if it is the beginning sound of the word or if it shows up in the middle of the word. So like mium, if it's in the middle, sounds very much like an American M, but if it comes out at the beginning of the word, for example on miane, it tends to sound much closer to a bium, like more percussive in it, and like I feel like a lot of people don't notice it, and when I bring it up, especially with like Korean speakers who are not teachers of language, of their native language to other people, they have no idea it's a thing until I ask them to pronounce it like it's in the middle of a word. How hard is that for like teaching or distinguishing between and like becoming aware of to make it easier?
Yeah, so that can definitely be a challenge for learners. What you're kind of getting at is what linguists will refer to as an allophonic distribution, and it's the idea that, yeah, these phonemes, they change a little bit depending on the context. And you're right, a lot of times native speakers are completely unaware of that. Another difficulty that learners tend to have is consonants at the end of words. I noticed this actually with a number of Russian speakers, but if you end a word with kyok or something, you actually just stop, you don't release it. So just taking a word like, I can't right now, a word ending with kyok. Okay, a word ending with pyok, so like pop. You just full stop, you cut off the sound, you don't release anything. But a lot of people, when they're learning, they say pop and kind of let out a little bit of air. And Koreans, they don't even have to think about that. That's the thing about your first language, you almost never have to think about it. So yeah, things like that do cause difficulty. When I designed the test, I made questions that cover the different positions that you can find each sound in. And on the score report that learners get, if they have a really consistent problem across many sounds, with, say, in that first position, like you said, it'll show up and say, like, hey, you have some difficulty pronouncing sounds at the beginning of words. I think I've heard about the mium and piuk thing.
It also comes up with piuk and biuk.
Yes.
So like if you say kabang, it sounds like very much like a B, but if you just say hung, like your room, it sounds more like somewhere in between a biuk and a piuk.
Right, so that's where at the beginning of words, Korean stops are they're not voiced. So voicing, this one's fairly easy to explain. You can feel it. So when you say kaban, when you're saying the b part, you can feel your throat vibrating, kaban. But if you say ha, you really don't start feeling that vibration until the vowel comes in. If you're speaking it like a Korean would. I still kind of voice them a little bit, some of the sounds. But like you say kaban, that ka, you really don't feel the voicing come in until that ah part of the syllable. So that's one thing. Yeah, voicing isn't contrastive. So if you say like gaban, like ga, like in English kind of G, Koreans will still understand you probably as saying kyo, because it's not a contrast, it's just an allophone. Allophones don't change the meaning. They don't change what the sound is. So yeah, that's certainly one of the reasons why certain sounds are hard to understand. Yeah, other questions? Yeah.
I'm interested in the link between production and perception. So it seemed like for most of your sounds on your fancy graph that the production came a little bit later. Right?
But actually,
Bottom.
perception is on the x-axis.
Oh, so production seems a little more accurate.
Right, and this sort of, right, would maybe be contrary to expectations. At least if you know, kind of buy into most of the research findings in like Tim Flagey's work, perception, perceived production, all that. What I think is happening here is it's a difference in scoring criteria. So for the perception tasks on the KPD, so these are just raw percentages. They haven't been scaled in any special way. The perception tasks in the KPD, they're either right or wrong. You know, they're forced choice. And so there's no leniency in the scoring. I mean, there's no way of determining how strongly a learner felt that was right or wrong, you know. Whereas with the production, a human scored those, and based on intelligibility, not sounding like a native speaker Korean, you know, Shia or Sanchia or whatever. It's just, could they identify it? Was it relatively unambiguous as not being any other Korean sound? So I think it's just a difference in scoring criteria. It's sort of inflating, perhaps, production scores compared to perception scores. Yeah, I don't think this is like some revolutionary piece of evidence saying that, oh no, you know, production can really exceed and precede perception.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the slope of the line is showing like, you know, you have to increase a lot in perception to get a little bit of production. So I think that makes sense to me, like how the line is just the scales, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the line's going up, that's what I was kind of happy to see. You know, okay,
yeah.
The relation that we'd expect is there. Yeah, maybe we would normally expect that correlation to be a little bit stronger. But yeah, I also think it kind of shows that, you know, and this is maybe a little sample dependent, but a lot of the cross-linguistically common phonemes tended to be relatively easy to produce. So again, it's things that people are already bringing into the language, so kind of lines up. Other questions? Yes.
Okay, bear with me here, because I can't quite figure out how I want to ask this, but I just was having this thought. So your research participants were from all different language learning communities and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm just based on what I'm thinking too. Like in English, when like, you know, we're like, oh, what word are you saying? Somebody can spell it out with the alphabet and like pretty easily. And you're like, oh, P-A-G-E. Ah, okay, yeah. Like that spelling doesn't always correlate to how it sounds, but we have like a way to quickly kind of give the alphabet to like draw it out in your mind. But then on the opposite hand, like Korean is very much like, there's no tricks with the consonant or the vowel is what you get. Like there's no tricks of like, it's spelled this way, but it's pronounced that way really, unless you're Romanizing, but I'm not talking about that. Like with that, but then when I'm like asked students to teach me a word or something to pronounce it, and I write it on the board, they're like, no, and they say it again, I'm like, and then they're like, and then they have to like say it, but it's like really awkward for them to have to like spell it from their seats for me, because I almost want them to just be like, here, take the chalk, come up here. So like, do you think that maybe, or like, Well, then too, a large portion of their participants were like Chinese speakers, Mandarin or Cantonese or something, and I don't think they have a way to like spell out a character like stroke 1, 2, 3, 4. You just have to like pronounce it again and produce it.
Yeah.
So do you think that there's any relationship of like using that like an alphabet to spell out things / pronunciation? Do you think that's somewhere related to this phoneme difficulty with people of different languages? I'm sorry, that's very messy.
No, it actually touches on a few things, your question here, and let me try to go through them. So I think generally to answer your question, it's not so much about whether there is an alphabet or isn't, but we do know from research that, at least for second language learners, the written form of the language can cause some sort of weird things to go on in terms of phonology. So they might sort of, how to explain this? They might sort of tie a phoneme to a particular letter, and they have some idea of what that letter should sound like, or if they still rely on romanization, which a lot of, say, English-speaking learners of Korean still do, they sort of kind of pull in some weird mappings of what the sound should be and sort of rely on those when they run into trouble pronouncing things or whatnot. So there are some sort of, effects of the writing system. But, so that's one part, that could come into it. But actually, people of different languages, I don't know about Korean if there's any particular need for sort of spelling stuff out, but I think sometimes people, I don't know, any Korean speakers, like when you're on the phone with somebody, like, and they don't know how to spell your name correctly, how to write your name, there might be ways of sort of negotiating that. For example, people who have like the syllable he in their name can be spelled like he, a-e versus, so sometimes they'll say things like o-e versus a-e for talking about the spelling. That's a little different from pronunciation. You mentioned though that Korean doesn't have any tricks. Well, for the most part it doesn't, but actually there are some tricks. So when you think of really common words like 한국말, there's no eung in that word, but the phonological form is always pronounced with an eung sound. Okay, so there are some tricks, and those can throw learners off, particularly when they're reading whole words that have those transformations you have to apply. And sometimes because when they think of the word, when they think of the pronunciation, they might sort of think of the written form. And so they'll say things like 한국말. They've never heard a Korean say 한국말, but just somehow in their head, because of the way it's written, that's sort of what they call up when they try to say the word. So there's that going on. The last thing, actually, because I had a colleague who was looking into this, Chinese speakers do have a way of sort of clarifying which characters they're talking about. They sort of do like air writing.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
I don't know if Koreans ever do this when trying to like show people how to write their hanja names or anything, but it's much less common, much less need for it. But yeah, Chinese speakers either on their hand or in the air kind of can do stuff. So yeah, life finds a way, what Jurassic Park language finds a way, people figure it out. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
The last comment, not question. I just want to say thank you so much. I actually learned a lot, and it was like great. And I'm really excited to say with the TOEFIC starting a speaking test starting in 2023. I'm really excited to see how this works.
So the plan is, I think they were supposed to have had a speaking test earlier on, but just like the high school English test was supposed to have a speaking test, but speaking part by now. But yeah, fingers crossed. I do hope they have.